box with small crayons. They make beautiful drawings. Red, yellow, blue, black, all sorts of them. I love my small box with crayons. With my golden yellow crayon, I draw the sun which shines over us. It shines so brilliantly over all China, because the sun is Chairman Mao. With my crayon that's black or brown, I draw a Negro boy, oppressed by the imperialists. Oh, dear friend, we will help you. Children everywhere will help you. Carefully with my crayon of red, I draw the red band of our nation. Always we will follow the party and the revolution, and we will beat American imperialism.
The People's Republic of China has been in existence for 15 years. These have not been tranquil years. The imperialists, headed by the United States, and the reactionaries of various countries have tried to strangle us by every means. Nevertheless, as Chairman Mao said, only heroes can quell tigers and leopards. Never will the brave be cowed by wild bears.
Peking, capital city of the People's Republic of China, Red China. The voice we hear is proud, strident, militant, claiming power not yet achieved, goals which may be only propaganda or may be real. Yet, only a few hundred miles from China's borders in South Vietnam, America's military power is growing. Will China's rulers read the daily battle reports as foreshadowing an inevitable American victory which cannot be tolerated? Will they choose war or a compromised peace? In the following hour, we'll try as best we can to answer that question through the eyes of experts who have been there this past year, and through films, some new, some historical, some propaganda. While making up a picture of communist China at this critical moment of history, 1966, perhaps the year of the gun. For nearly 2 decades since the communists seized power in 1949, China has kept much of Asia at war, sometimes using her own vast manpower, and is often urging her neighbors into wars of national liberation, fighting China's cause without spilling Chinese blood. Here in Korea, a major war in the 1950s which still haunts the foreign offices of the world because it included hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops. Off of the Formosa Strait, shelling of Quemoy and Matsu in 58 and 62. In Indochina, Chinese help for the Viet Minh who drove out the French in 54. Tensions and threats along the Burmese border. Tibet, forcibly invaded and seized and now made part of the Republic of China. India, once a friend, invaded in 1962, threatened again in 65. And now along the twisting border with Russia, threats, troops, and even the movement of refugees. As American bombs drop in Vietnam, this tiny but strategic quarter of Asia, sometimes falling within 40 miles of the Chinese border, Peking's rulers are openly exhorting their people to prepare for war against the main enemy, the United States. Our leaders believe they know which moves on our part could provoke the Chinese rulers in Peking to decide on war, and Washington is determined to avoid these moves. But America's leaders are also determined to stand fast in Vietnam. In assessing their ability to wage war, China's leaders have not far to look to find their chief strength. It is China's enormous landmass, 150,000 square miles larger than the United States, plus its people, mostly crowded in a thick band toward the coast. Experts guess there are between 730 and 750 million Chinese here. By the year 1980, there will be 1 billion Chinese. It is on the backs of this vast manpower that China moves today, as it has done for untold centuries. Even in the cities, she moves mostly on bicycle power. Primitive, yes, to those of us in the West who have traded muscle power for machine power. But if we are to understand China today, her strengths, her weaknesses, and her intentions for peace or war, we must look at China through Chinese eyes. Who are their leaders? How do they exercise absolute power over so vast a population? On top of the leadership pyramid is the national idol, the unifier, the leader of the revolution, Mao Zedong, now being deified by that revolution, turned into a god to hold China together after he dies.
Our beloved and respected Chairman Mao, it is you who inspire us with willful revolution. It is you who lead us from victory to victory. It is you who make us understand that we may pride ourselves on being Chinese. It is you who teach us to grasp the worldwide significance of the Chinese Revolution. We will follow you forever and march on triumphantly.
He is an old man, 73 at this point, who obviously shows signs of the very difficult life that he has led.
Mark Gain of the Toronto Star knew the communist leaders in the 1940s. He visited them again last year. Since their decisions for peace or war will be based partly on their knowledge of us, I asked Mr. Gain if they seem to understand us.
There has been no change in the minds of the leaders of China between 1947, when I spoke to them in the Northwest in the caves, and last year. On every key issue, their thinking remains the same. Now, if I may illustrate this to you, I went to see Mao in his cave. At one point in our meeting, which lasted for 10 hours, Mao Zedong asked me how soon would the Great Depression come to the United States. Now, this was in February of 1947. He said, the fact is that once you have this depression, which must come, then the toiling masses of Americans will march on Washington, and they will overthrow the Wall Street government, and they will establish a democratic regime that will be friendly to democratic governments outside, democratic systems, including our own, including the Chinese Communist.
Mr. Gain was in China again last year during the Vietnam protest marches in Washington.
And here was an editorial saying that great masses of Americans have converged on Washington. The toiling masses of Americans have decided they've had enough of this imperialist, bandit Wall Street government. 17 years, the interpretation of social and political currents in the United States has remained unchanged.
Mao's misunderstanding of the United States is apparently shared by all China's top leaders, who are as tough as Mao and old. These are official portraits the Chinese people see everywhere. Mao's chosen successor is Liu Shaoqi, 68, China's president. I asked Mr. Gain how Liu compared to Mao.
Their minds are exactly alike. If anything, there's a slight variation in their thinking. I found Mao Zedong slightly more moderate than Liu Shaoqi. I remember Mao Zedong was talking about the possibility of taking Chiang Kai-shek into some sort of a coalition government. Liu Shaoqi's comment was very simple: kill him.
Best known of China's top leaders is Zhou Enlai, 68, former foreign minister and world traveler. He is now the Chinese prime minister. Marshal Zhu De, 80, father of the Red Chinese Army, leading general in the war against Chiang Kai-shek. Deng Xiaoping, 66, main spokesman in the bitter feud with Moscow. Lin Biao, a mere 58, defense minister, issued last year's famous blueprint for China's worldwide revolution. Chen Yun, 65, a top-flight economic planner even by Western standards. Such are the men who will decide whether indeed 1966 is to be the year of the gun. Will they allow old prejudices, old suspicions to warp their decisions? Suspicion of foreigners and foreign ideas lies deep in China's heritage. To keep foreigners out, she built her Great Wall, and behind it lived in splendid isolation. Today, her leaders have built a more fearsome wall, a wall of propaganda through which no ideas except approved ideas can penetrate. If Mao should call for war with the United States, China's people will follow him and believe they will win. These posters tell them so, and there is no one to say otherwise. Contact with Westerners is discouraged, as ABC News cameraman Ole Niesgaard discovered. Niesgaard, a Dane, spent a month filming in Red China for this report. He asked to interview people.
The answer was that I arrived speaking as a cameraman, not as a correspondent, so as a cameraman I couldn't ask a question. They asked me to go out to make film about the workers' settlement, which should be something very modern. And they asked me to go out and do a film about that, something they would like to show. And then I say, well, I will do that, but I would also at the same time like to show people how the slum is. After 2 days, I get permission to go out to the slum. I come out to the quarter of Shanghai and was received on the street by thousands and thousands of people. Well, thousands of people that was waiting in the streets. He was well nicely dressed, and when I walk on the streets, they applaud me, and I had, of course, applaud them too. But it was arranged. It was a part of the program. It was arranged before I went out there. They had to take 2 days to do it, and then I was received by thousands of people. It's awful easy to go around in China and do a film if you just do as the people want, as the guys want you to do.
In short, do as you're told, and they do, for they are constantly reminded of how bad things were and how good they are now by comparison. A Chinese-Russian propaganda film recalls China's bitter past, her poverty and her humiliation by foreigners.
It was in such exhaustive drudgery that the people lived in a land where sweat and tears were equally cheap. Shanghai was a city of the most cruel exploitation of man.
As with all effective propaganda, this has a basis in fact. Dr. Han Su-yin, author of A Many-Splendored Thing and The Crippled Tree, was born and raised in China. She visits her homeland often. She tells ABC's Lou Chaffee about pre-revolutionary times.
I got quite close to seeing the real problem of China, the problem of peasant poverty, the problem of the land. The 85 to 90% of the people on the land living in absolutely miserable conditions. And it was absolutely no use making beautiful cities, because these beautiful cities were just like pimples, you know, superimposed on this poverty. In Sichuan, which is my province, it meant that there were 148 taxes to pay. 148 taxes to pay by the peasant. And some of the taxes in Sichuan were levied 70 years ahead, so that the poor peasant never had any means of accumulating capital. He could never become, in other words, even moderately prosperous. If he struck a bad year, he went to the landowner, who was also the usurer, to borrow money. And money interest was at 36 to 59%, and in times of famine, 100% a year interest. And I think it is very important to realize that it is from this mass of poverty that has sprung the communist revolution.
Today, the regime decrees that the revolution must not be forgotten. During and shortly after the revolution, a Russian film company, using a Chinese cast of thousands, recreated the bloodshed, the revenge against the landlords, and the victory for audiences inside China and out.
The peasants brought the landowners to trial, took away the land they had stolen and the homes they had built with the tears and suffering of the people.
This scene was carefully staged. Notice that in front of the tank, you can see the tracks from the rehearsal.
This is the residence of the traitor to the people, Chiang Kai-shek. There was no longer any force in the whole world that could stop or retard the liberation of all China. The army had brought them emancipation from the landowner's yoke and from the plunder of the Kuomintang officials. It had brought them liberty. These young people wrote, "Long live Mao Zedong! Long live the People's Liberation Army!" Mao Zedong proclaims the birth of the People's Republic of China.
The year was 1949. Out of the upheaval came Mao's China, moving at times rapidly, at times haltingly, but moving. Mark Gain, back after 17 years, observes.
There's a great deal of change, and at the same time there's very little. First, the very small change. It is especially obvious in the villages. I would drive into a village and I would have to pinch myself to realize that 17 years have elapsed since my previous visit. Everything remained the same, including even people pulling plows and men, women, and children pushing these tremendous grindstones, millstones, to grind their grain. But there was also at the same time a very impressive and vast change that I found. It was certainly obvious in education.
In pre-revolutionary China, there were virtually no free public schools. Today, there are 1 million free primary schools with 100 million students. These youngsters are learning characters. When they can read, Peking will provide the text. Again, Mark Gain.
In the past, you had epidemics in China. Well, the epidemics have been stopped. You don't find children with scabs on them, children with rickets. You don't find children with distended bellies. The sights that used to almost to tear at your heart in the past, in the 40s and the 30s, these sights are no longer there.
Another observer of change is Morris Wills, an American soldier in the Korean War. He was captured, then defected to China for 11 years. He returned to the United States last fall. U.S. officials consider his understanding of the Chinese city dweller unique in the West.
He now has a feeling of security. He knows that he's always going to have something to eat, and a place to stay, and something to wear. It doesn't preoccupy his mind at all where the next meal is coming from. It may not be very much, it may not be very good, but at least there's going to be something.
What Wills observed is true in the cities today. During the harvest seasons, a variety of food is available in the city. In the countryside, It's more hit and miss. China today manufactures some of nearly everything, but most of it is too expensive for the average worker. In Shanghai, for example, leather shoes cost 1 week's wages. Appliances, even the old-fashioned treadle-type sewing machine, cost a city worker his entire pay for 4 months. A television set would cost him his pay for over a year. And anyway, television programming is available only in the big cities and for but a few hours a day. Even then, most people must watch in public gathering places, like Peking's North Lake Park, once the playground of emperors. To many, it seems a good life, a convincing reason to support the communist regime. Morris Wills.
I'd say that most of the young people believe that life is better in China now today than it was under Chiang Kai-shek. And a certain percentage of the older people also believe it's better. And I am inclined to believe that, that their life is better than it was under Chiang Kai-shek.
If life for the average Chinese is better than it was before the revolution, if the people know only what the regime wants them to know, then they would follow their leaders into the year of the gun if Mao decides to pull the trigger. Two questions then arise. Is there meaningful dissent inside China, and can China's economy sustain a major war? Is there dissent in China today? If so, from whom? Spectaculars like this in the Peking Workers' Stadium would have us believe there is no dissent. If not, where will the leaders lead their regimented people, like those in the stands turning the pages of the revolution's history? Group calisthenics are traditional in Chinese culture. This is Tai Chi Chuan, the slow public exercise which dates back thousands of years. The concept of the individual and of individual freedom plays no part in China's heritage. China's civilization is ancient, stretching back nearly 4,000 years. And throughout these centuries, China has looked upon herself as the cultural center of the world because of a firmly organized society. And regimentation that would be intolerable for us seems perfectly natural to most Chinese. Who then flees Red China and the totalitarian regimentation of Mao? And where do they go? There are two routes of escape. One is through Lo Wu, entrance to Hong Kong. Here, there's a little covered railroad bridge that marks the bamboo curtain. On this side, a few Hong Kong police patrol the paths and roads. A few hundred yards away, Chinese communist soldiers walk across the fields, some carrying submachine guns. Those who cross here do it with Chinese approval. But in past years, more than 500,000 refugees have come over illegally, literally swarming over these hills. Sometimes the waves of refugees have been so enormous that men, women, and children have tumbled over each other coming down the hillsides. Some of them died within sight of their goal. The Chinese have closed down the bamboo curtain again, and only a trickle of people come through legally. Those who make it come by way of the bridge at Lo Wu to the railroad depot at Hong Kong. They come out for many reasons, mostly personal. But illegal traffic still continues, though on a reduced scale. Altogether, 2 million Chinese have made it to Hong Kong since 1949. One thing they all seem to have in common is fear. Fear that there will be retaliation against their families in China. To Peking, Hong Kong means not death, but literally life. Here, Red China sells almost a third of her exports, including propaganda which earns no immediate return. But cement does, to build Hong Kong's skyscrapers. So does food to feed the colony's 4 million inhabitants. So does everything from drinking water to antiques, stripped from Chinese temples and worth their weight in foreign currency. Her $500 million worth of trade with Hong Kong each year is funneled through the Bank of China to buy food, fertilizer, and capital equipment from the outside world. Those for whom Mao's China has been most like a prison are the intellectuals who have known the meaning of freedom of the individual. ABC's Malcolm Brown spoke with 3 such refugees, born in China, educated in America, and lured back to China by the ideals of the revolution. Their faces cannot be shown. They spoke of constant surveillance.
There are party members around you everywhere.
Suppose
in the office, there are party members and young league members. And even at home, so your children are educated to report you.
Your children are educated to report you?
Yeah.
Would they do it?
Sure, they
Yes.
would.
Oh, those things, we had a lot of them.
Yeah.
Suppose some children would write to their fathers, I don't want to be your son.
I don't want to be your son.
Something like that. It's quite easy, quite popular.
Every few months, Peking decrees a new propaganda campaign for the Dominican rebels, for the Viet Cong, always against the United States. If you lack enthusiasm, you'll be consigned to study the line.
Every campaign, see, your boss, the party member will come up to you and tell you, now from today on, you're going to stay in office. You won't go home? Well, you just stay in office for months. You can't leave the office. And you cannot talk freely with anybody else.
I see. But
you have a
technically, you're not arrested.
No.
So you carry on your normal
No,
life
no,
now,
no.
I see.
But
The
you
office
study politics,
You study politics, I see.
newspapers, confess, self-criticism, to write down.
Do you ever want to go back to China again, any of you?
Oh, no. We had such a hard work to get out of it. Never.
This disillusionment is reflected by Jacques Marcoux, correspondent in Peking for the French press agency until last year. Marcoux, who knew the old China, was interviewed this year by ABC's Louis Rukeyser.
Jacques, you have written that life in Peking was like living in a sanatorium with 6 million patients. What do you mean by that?
Well, you see, I had myself spent a year in a sanatorium, and I was struck by a similarity of atmosphere.
Mr. Marcoux explained that in a sanatorium, the first thing that is drilled into you is that you must have absolute, unquestioning confidence in your doctor. The Chinese, Marcoux said, treat 700 million people as if they were all patients, and the cure offered these patients is communism. It is their religion replacing all traditional worship.
There isn't any religion as we know religion. Their religion, of course, is communism. To them, communism is a religion in China today. Christianity, of course, has almost been totally wiped out, and the few small enclaves that are left there, few small churches or groups, are nothing but showpieces. And that's the only reason they're kept going, is because they are showpieces.
It may not be the right thing for anybody else. It certainly wouldn't be right for for America. America has a completely different system which works. But why shouldn't every country have the system that it wants?
Dr. Han Suyen, do you think that you could live in China now? Do you think you'd be happy there? Could you stand the propaganda, the regimentation, and so on?
Well, that is a question that has often been asked of me. And my answer is this, and has always been this, that as a doctor, because I'm also a medical doctor, as you know, I don't think I would have had any trouble in adjusting, and especially in finding great satisfaction, as many of the technical personnel find. But as a writer, of course, the problem is different. And I have found that in a period of great turmoil and revolution and upheaval, life for a writer is not very nice. Because at that moment, men's passions and emotions are very much up, and there is much more pamphleteering and propaganda, let's face it. I am quite hopeful that in 10 years' time, it will be possible, even for somebody like myself, so controversial and unconventional and individualistic, to write and live in China.
But how many, like Dr. Han, have known freedom and resist regimentation? Morris Wills.
There has always been a certain number of people there on the mainland, naturally, who have opposed, resisted the regime. But of course, this number has never been very, very great in comparison to the total population. Certainly never more than 10 or 15%.
These people are not willing to do anything about it, is that right?
Well, I wouldn't say they aren't willing to do anything about it. The thing is that they can't do anything about it. Certainly a lot of them would like to do something about it, but there's just no possibility. There's no chance.
If regimentation is complete and no revolt possible, will Mao lead his people to war? This map is the famous blueprint for conquest outlined last year by Defense Minister Lin Biao. The underdeveloped world, the countryside, colored dark, is to rise against the prosperous cities, the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. It is the classic guerrilla tactic that won victory for the communists in China and which they rely on to defeat the Americans in Vietnam. But in Vietnam, although the communists control the countryside, the tide of battle is slowly turning against them. And around the world in the past year, China's cause has suffered major diplomatic setbacks. Indonesia, Cuba, Ghana, Algeria, Central Africa. And there has been spectacular failure by Peking to convince the underdeveloped nations to line up on China's side in the deepening split with Russia. Secure within their borders, with no important dissent among their vast population, China's aging leaders now see loss of face around the world. The question is, even if she wants to, will China, can China match her belligerent words with deeds? If this is to be the year of the gun, if China's leaders mean to fight, they must have an economy and a military machine capable of fighting a major war. Have they? Certainly not by Western standards. China's agriculture is in a state of crisis. Natural disasters plus a good deal of mismanagement produced a succession of crop failures in the early 60s and pushed China to the edge of starvation. Last year's harvest was no better than that of 1957, and there were nearly 100 million more Chinese mouths to feed. All farmers in China today work for the state. When the revolution triumphed, the land was taken from the hated landlords and given to the peasants. In a great bloodbath, nearly 1 million landlords were slaughtered. But only a few years later, the individual plots were taken back by the state and communized. Now, there are 70,000 communes trying to do what no communist state has ever done effectively, modernize agriculture. To do so, it has to use more politics than fertilizer, more manpower than machines. Mark Gain, who visited the communes last year, observes.
A commune is also a very complex, a very efficient political organism through which Peking can regulate, can coordinate, can control the 550 million people in the countryside. The Chinese leadership is aware of the backwardness of the villages, and they're trying to raise the educational level of the villages. Last year they sent something like 310,000 high school graduates from cities into the countryside. In fact, one of the official explanations for sending these youngsters is that they've become soft in the cities. They will not become real revolutionaries until they work with their hands, until they live the life of a peasant. So they go into the villages and they pull plows and they do hard, truly hard manual work. Chinese villages today are somewhere in the Middle Ages.
Also in the Middle Ages, industrially speaking, are China's factories and production techniques, pathetically inadequate for war. When the communists took over, China had little industry. The Soviet Union came to China's aid with massive shipments of machinery plus engineers to install and operate the new equipment. China increased her steel output tenfold, but last year's total production, 9.5 million tons, about equals 1 month's production in the United States. In 1960, the Chinese-Russian quarrel caused Nikita Khrushchev to end all Soviet technical aid.
Now, in 1965, last year, I was in the greatest machine-building plant in China. As we were going out, I saw some very sophisticated machines standing by the gate, unattached, unused. So I asked the manager what this was, and he said, oh, this was some machinery, Soviet machinery, that was brought in the spring of 1960. And then the Russians walked out, they took their blueprints with them, and we still have not figured out how to use them. 5 years.
But it's not what they have, it's what they think they have. Mark Gain.
Well, they're constantly reminded of the fact that China is a great industrial power. They're told that, or they were told in the late 50s that almost any day after breakfast, China is going to catch up with Britain as a great industrial nation. They hear this and they believe it.
And they're proud of what they have. The military establishment, like agriculture and industry, is unprepared for modern war. The regular army numbers 150 divisions. Total military manpower about equals our own. But behind the army is China's ace in the hole, manpower, a gigantic home guard militia of 10 million constantly in training. To support her manpower, China has bases, Army, Navy, and Air Force, shown in dark color along her borders and coastline. The Air Force is second-rate. The Navy, not much more than old patrol vessels. On paper, the communist military establishment is clearly no match for ours, deployed at the bases shown in light colors, stretching in a crescent from Japan to Southeast Asia. Among these bases are those of our ally, the Republic of China, on the island of Taiwan, only 100 miles from the Chinese mainland. Here, an aging Chiang Kai-shek presides over 12 million inhabitants and a number of islands, including Quemoy and Matsu, strongholds within easy shelling distance of the mainland. From here, the nationalists send up propaganda balloons, urging the mainlanders to defect. Today, Chiang's army, 600,000 strong, keeps itself in fighting trim with American methods and American equipment. Chiang's weapons are modern, but he's pledged not to use them in an invasion of communist China without American permission. On a clear day, mainland China is easily visible. Across that narrow strait, the Red Chinese are also training for the same kind of guerrilla war that's being fought in Vietnam.
The kind of a war that they visualize is always a guerrilla war. And contrary to what is being said in the United States, my feeling is that this is a tremendously effective type of war.
In the empty, desolate Xinjiang region at a place called Lop Nor, China exploded its first nuclear device. This successful test also set off a tremor of fear throughout Asia. The Chinese mushroom cloud served notice that Peking soon would have the credentials to demand a place at the top table of great nations. A second successful test last year demonstrated that the Chinese are devoting enormous priority, brain power, and resources to developing a nuclear arsenal, including a delivery system, all at a time when the rest of China's economy seems driven by bicycle power. But China's leaders seem unimpressed with atomic weapons, as Mao explained to Mark Gain years ago.
Mao said, the fact is that the atomic bomb is merely a new gadget in weaponry. He said the Americans could send 10,000 planes with 10,000 atom bombs over China and drop them on 10,000 villages. And they would destroy, wipe out the 10,000 villages. But we would have enough villages left so that we could go on and fight and win. He said, we're too primitive to fear the atom bomb.
To be primitive does not necessarily mean to be weak. The Chinese look upon themselves as strong in culture, in Marxist determination, and manpower. That manpower, as we have seen, is Mao's to use as he chooses, in ways the Chinese have always used manpower. To the Chinese, it is the goal that matters, not the means or costs along the way. No matter how primitive your economy, given enough manpower, you can build a railroad. Can you also fight a major war? Mao Zedong and the leaders of Red China will decide. How do those American officials most deeply concerned with China today evaluate her intentions? What should our government's policy be? Isolation and containment of China, or just containment? For this program, I talked with Secretary of State Dean Rusk about his estimate of China's long-range plans and asked him who was to blame for isolating China from the rest of the world.
As far as the United States is concerned, we've been engaged in conversations with them for more than 10 years. We've had our 129th bilateral talk with them, talks that occurred in Geneva and in Warsaw. We'll be having another one with them next month. We have been in closer touch with them, I suppose, than almost any government that has diplomatic relations with them, with the exception possibly of Moscow. This is not a deliberate attempt by everyone else to forget Peiping or to freeze them out of the total situation. We know they're there. We know that they ought to be drawn into major questions such as peace in Southeast Asia, such as disarmament. And many efforts have been made to bring them into those discussions. But their own attitude has made it very difficult to get them into a position of real discussion with those with whom they bitterly disagree.
Mr. Secretary, in fighting the Vietnam War, do we seek to avoid military moves which the Chinese might regard as a prelude to an American invasion of the mainland?
Well, I think it's only on the basis of an ideological bias that they would have any idea that we have an interest in attacking mainland China. There have been many occasions when we might have done so had that been our desire. The Korean War was such an occasion. The offshore islands crisis was another one. Southeast Asia is another one. Now, the United States is not interested in war with mainland China. We're not interested in expanding these operations in Southeast Asia. The escalation of that war has been a responsibility of Hanoi, encouraged and backed by Peiping. One does hear out of Peiping itself discussion of the inevitability of war, and they have on occasion said that they would hoped that the revisionists, meaning the Soviets, would not take such a gloomy view of war. Well, I think most of the world takes a pretty gloomy view of war and ought to. I do believe that there is, in fact, a prudence in Peiping. And I do believe their leaders are rational.
As you look ahead in the years to come, Mr. Secretary, what prospects do you see that the Chinese leadership will change their present harsh policies and change their rather primitive view of looking at the world?
I think there's some prospect of that over time. I don't think that it's a matter that depends upon United States military action. I don't expect completely irrational action from them. I think it is possible that they may underestimate our determination, that they may make some miscalculation on the assumption that somehow we would not follow through to the end of the day. But I think little by little they must be getting the impression that we are serious in Southeast Asia and that there can be peace just as soon as the infiltration of men in arms from the north stops.
As you've heard, Secretary Russ believes the rulers of China are prudent and rational, despite the violence of their threats and the virtual collapse of their ambitious plans for extending Chinese communism around the world. But the frustration they feel is dangerous, and it will grow each day as American military power gains, as it will, in the struggle against the Chinese-supported guerrillas in Vietnam. It is true, as you have seen, that the Chinese, for all their manpower, do not have the military or economic base to fight a major war against the United States. But this is an assessment our leaders must make with Western logic. And in recent history, our intelligence badly miscalculated communist intentions in two grave crises. Only days before the Chinese communists intervened in Korea, our intelligence predicted they would not. Just before Nikita Khrushchev moved his missiles into Cuba, the entire intelligence community predicted he would never dare risk such a reckless move. At the moment, their prediction is the Chinese will stay out of South Vietnam, even though it represents a supreme test of Mao Zedong's blueprint for expanding Chinese power. However, there are disturbing signs. The Chinese have started to move army units into North Vietnam. These troops are manning Chinese anti-aircraft batteries and maintaining a key supply railroad which connects communist China with Hanoi. There are now more than 20,000, and the number is growing. Thus, there is every prospect 1966 will become a year of confronting Chinese military power in North Vietnam as our bombers step up their attacks against targets there. We can and we will meet this threat, but inevitably we will kill Chinese, taking us another step closer to the larger war we wish to avoid. The question thus arises, if we intend to pursue the war in Vietnam, as I think we should, is it time to consider some safety valve gestures to give the Chinese a face-saving retreat, even as we gave Nikita Khrushchev a way out of the Cuban Missile dilemma? 2 years ago, before our military buildup in Vietnam, such gestures would have been interpreted as weakness and a prelude to retreat. But since we have now made clear our intention to stay in Vietnam, such gestures made today from a position of military strength no longer would panic the allies we need in Asia. On the contrary, it would also mobilize world opinion on our side, making clearer that any decision for war will be China's. And in fact, our government at this very moment is considering such a gesture. At its root is the realization that it is entirely possible that Dr. Strangelove resides in Peking. This is John Scali, ABC News, Washington.